Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. I've lived my whole life in Chicago. My dad has too, so did my grandpa. We come from a long line of fishermen, something my dad likes to brag about every chance he gets. According to him, we're the best that Lake Michigan has ever seen. I never really cared for it. As a kid, I'd go out on the boat with Dad and Grandpa, watching them work, hauling in nets, and reading the water like some kind of ancient language. They could feel the lake, understand it in a way that I never could. To them, it wasn't just a body of water, it was a partner. Something to respect, but never fear. I never felt the same way. There was always something off about the lake. People talk about rip currents and freak accidents, but that never explained the disappearances. Whole boats, gone without a trace. Swimmers getting sucked under on perfectly calm days. People blaming the Bermuda Triangle of the Great Lakes. I wasn't stupid. I knew better than to say anything out loud. Dad and Grandpa never talked about it. They weren't afraid, so I wasn't supposed to be either. But I still stayed away. The alert came in early autumn, right when school had started up again. Emergency alert. Do not swim in the lake. Do not take your boats out on the water. Do not go near the lake. I stared at my phone, confused. Everyone already knew that. The lake was dangerous. That wasn't news. Why the hell was the government sending out an official warning? At home, Dad and Grandpa were sitting in the living room, the TV blaring. I could tell by their faces that they had seen the alert too. But they weren't confused. They were watching the news like they already knew what was coming. Authorities confirm a rising number of disappearances on Lake Michigan in the last week, including boats, swimmers, and other vessels. The Coast Guard has no explanation at this time. Officials urge all citizens to remain away from the water until further notice. Dad looked at Grandpa, his jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the arm of his chair. Could it be? I frowned. Could what be? What is it? I asked. Grandpa didn't look up, he was staring at the screen, barely blinking. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, hollow. They are awake. I shifted uncomfortably. Grandpa had always been a little out there. Nothing serious, nothing dangerous. Just old man weirdness. The kind of thing that made Dad roll his eyes and tell me to ignore it. Doctors called it age-related confusion, nothing to worry about. But this didn't sound like Grandpa being forgetful. This sounded like he knew something. I glanced at Dad, expecting him to laugh it off. Tell Grandpa to go to bed, or take his meds, or whatever he normally did. But he didn't. Instead, he asked, "Have you seen the eyes?" Grandpa shook his head, slowly, deliberately. No. He turned to Dad. You know, I would have told you. A cold, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. They weren't confused, they weren't laughing. They knew exactly what was happening. And I didn't have a clue. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying their words, over and over. What did they mean? What eyes? What the hell did Grandpa mean by "they are awake"? I was still awake when the next emergency alert came through. Emergency alert. Avoid the lake at all costs. This is not a drill. I stared at my screen, heart pounding. Something was very, very wrong. At first, I thought the alerts would stop. Maybe it was some technical glitch or a temporary precaution. But as the days passed, the warnings kept coming. At first, it was once a day. Always the same urgent message, telling people to stay away from the lake. Then, they started coming every few hours. People weren't ignoring them anymore. The city started locking things down. Popular beaches were taped off. Shipyards refused entry to boat owners. Even the Coast Guard, the people who were supposed to patrol and rescue, had stopped going out onto the water. And the disappearances? They kept climbing. At first, it was just a few missing fishermen, a couple of swimmers who didn't come back. But now, it wasn't dozens, it was thousands. Every day, more people and boats vanished. And it wasn't just in Chicago. It was happening in other states, other cities, anywhere Lake Michigan touched. Even the president spoke about it. A nationwide emergency. And yet somehow nobody knew what was happening. No bodies, no wreckage, no answers. And my dad still kept going to work. I tried to talk to him, but he either got angry or walked away. Grandpa had gone completely silent, and every time I walked in on them whispering, they'd shut up immediately, like they didn't want me to hear. It drove me insane. I wasn't just worried anymore, I was furious. If they weren't going to care about their own safety, then I would, and I was going to find out the truth. I didn't sleep that night. I knew Dad and Grandpa would be heading out to the lake early in the morning, but on weekends, they usually went later than usual. That gave me time to sneak onto the boat. It wasn't hard. I'd spent enough time at the shipyard as a kid to know where everything was, and more importantly, where to hide. When I arrived, the place was eerily silent. No voices, no distant hum of boat engines, just the sound of lapping water, slow and rhythmic against the docks. Something was off. I stepped closer and felt a chill run down my spine. The water, it was wrong. I'd seen the lake at all hours of the day, sunrise, midnight, even during storms. But it had never looked like this. It was too dark. Not just deep blue like the early morning water sometimes got. It was black, like ink, like oil, like something was bleeding into it from below. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks on me. That if I stood there long enough, the sunrise would chase away the darkness. But it didn't. I thought I heard a splash, something breaking the surface. I spun around, but the water was still. I swallowed hard and climbed onto Dad's boat. The hardest part was finding a place to hide. Below deck was mostly storage and engine compartments, filled with nets, equipment, and old junk Grandpa refused to throw away. I found a cupboard just big enough to fit me, cleared out some old gear, and squeezed myself inside. Then I waited. An hour later, I heard footsteps on the dock. They climbed onto the boat, 2 sets of boots. Dad and Grandpa. The engine rumbled to life, and we set off. I stayed put, barely breathing, my knees pressed to my chest. I needed to wait. I needed them to be too far from shore to turn back. Only then could I confront them. I don't know how much time passed before the engine slowed to a stop. I knew where we were now. They were preparing the nets, getting ready to do the same work they always did. I took a deep breath. It was time. Carefully, I pushed open the cupboard and climbed out. My legs ached from being cramped in one position for so long, but I forced myself up the stairs. As soon as I reached the deck, Dad nearly ran straight into me. He jumped back in shock, eyes wide. "Amber? What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was pure panic. I crossed my arms. "You're not gonna turn back, are you?" Dad spun on his heel, storming toward the helm, and I ran after him. "Dad, stop. You're not gonna just run from this." We burst into the small steering cabin, where Grandpa sat at the controls. He turned at the sound of our footsteps, and when he saw me, his face went pale, like he had seen a ghost. Then, in a whisper, he said, "No." My stomach twisted. Grandpa wasn't angry, he wasn't annoyed, he was afraid. Before I could even process it, Dad shoved Grandpa out of the seat and grabbed the wheel. He spun it so hard the whole boat tilted to one side, throwing me off balance. Then he slammed the throttle forward. We lurched ahead at full speed. The wind whipped through my hair, stinging my eyes as I grabbed onto the doorway to keep from falling. Tears burned down my cheeks. "Just tell me the truth." I screamed over the roar of the motor. But before Dad could answer, the engine cut out. The boat slowed. Then, it stopped completely. I barely had time to react before Dad rushed past me, disappearing down into the engine room. I was alone with Grandpa now. He looked at me, eyes filled with something I'd never seen before. Pity. Then he stood up and pulled me into a tight hug. "It's all right," he murmured. "The lake doesn't need you. It won't take you." My breath hitched. What does that mean? I pulled away, my hands shaking, my mind screaming for answers. Grandpa, please, just tell me what's going on. Do you even understand how much I worry about you two every time you go out here? Do you care at all? Grandpa opened his mouth to finally say something. Then, the boat started to shake. Not just rocking from the waves, rattling, like a tin can being shaken by an unseen hand. I stumbled forward, bracing myself against the wall as the entire boat quivered beneath us. A deep, unnatural rumble filled the air. And then, through the tiny window, I saw it. The water. It was pitch black now, and it was moving. Not waves, not currents. The things inside it. 12 glowing red eyes swirling and writhing, twisting around each other in a tangled mess of bodies. I stared, frozen, my throat dry, my heart hammering against my ribs. Grandpa? My voice came out shaky, barely a whisper. What is that? Grandpa inhaled deeply, slow and heavy, like a man preparing for something inevitable. Then, in that same hollow voice, he answered, I told you. He turned to me, his face lined with sorrow. They are awake. The boat shook violently, the metal frame groaning under the strain. The sound was unbearable, like it was being crushed from all sides. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare at the nightmare outside the window. The lake was alive. Not with waves, not with currents, but with them. Dozens, no hundreds, of glowing red eyes moved in the depths, shifting and writhing, bodies tangled together in an endless twisting mass. They were serpentine, long and coiling, their shapes merging and separating, impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. A thick, sickening, churning sound filled the air as they moved beneath us. The way they twisted, knotted together like a pit of wriggling worms, made my stomach turn. They weren't in the water. They were the water. Grandpa, I whispered, my voice barely there. What are they? He didn't answer. Because he didn't know. The realization made my stomach drop. Grandpa knew they existed, but he had no idea what they were. Then a sickening thud. Something slammed into the side of the boat, hard enough to knock me off my feet. I hit the ground on my knees, bracing myself against the wall as the entire vessel lurched to one side. Help. Dad's voice. I scrambled to my feet, sprinting toward the deck just as Grandpa did the same. We burst outside, and my blood ran cold. Dad was on the ground, struggling, something wrapped around his leg. It was one of them. A long, dark body, thick as a tree trunk, was coiled around his calf, its skin slick and black like oil. It stretched over the railing, its massive bulk still tangled with the others, its length disappearing into the thrashing water below. And its mouth, it was open too wide, an impossible stretch of flesh lined with rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. It wasn't biting him. It was dragging him. The axe, Dad screamed, clawing at the wooden boards, trying to fight back against the pull. Get me the damn axe! I looked around frantically, but my hands were shaking too much. I couldn't see it, couldn't think. The thing lurched, pulling Dad closer to the edge. No! I lunged forward, grabbing onto his arm, trying to keep him on the boat. But it was so strong. The muscles beneath its black skin rippled as it squeezed tighter, and Dad let out a strangled yell. Then, a sharp whistle cut through the chaos. I turned just in time to see Grandpa with the harpoon. He threw it with deadly accuracy, and the tip sank deep into the eel's body. It let out an inhuman screech, so high-pitched and unnatural that I clapped my hands over my ears. Then, it let go. Dad collapsed onto the deck, gasping, pulling himself away from the edge as the creature retracted into the water. But the boat was still shaking. Beneath us, the massive bodies churned, the eyes watching, waiting, as if deciding what to do next. We weren't safe. We weren't getting out of this. Dad grabbed my arm, his face wild with panic and fury. Why did you come? He shouted, shaking me. Why? Tears spilled down my cheeks. Because I care, I sobbed. I care about you and Grandpa, and I don't want to be left alone. The boat lurched harder, the boards groaning under the strain. Dad turned to Grandpa, his voice breaking. It won't hold, Dad. Grandpa nodded, his expression calm. He already knew that. He reached up and brushed a tear from my cheek, his hands warm, steady. I love you both, he said softly. Then before we could stop him, before we could even react, he stood up. Dad grabbed for him, but Grandpa pulled free. You know what must be done. And then he climbed onto the deck. I screamed. But it was too late. The hatch slammed shut, locking us below. A beat of silence. Then a single, soul-pierced scream. And then nothing. The rattling stopped. The boat stopped shaking. Everything was still. I barely registered Dad shoving open the hatch, crawling up onto the deck first, checking if it was safe. I followed after him, my heart lodged in my throat. But the moment I looked at the lake, I froze. The water, it was blue again. Clear, as if nothing had ever happened. Grandpa was gone. Dad turned to me, his face broken, his eyes hollow. He didn't say anything. He just hugged me. I'm sorry, Princess. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry. And then he broke down completely. A sound I had never heard before. A grown man crying like a child. The ride home was silent. Neither of us said a word. The days after Grandpa was gone were suffocatingly quiet. Dad didn't talk. He barely ate. He barely existed. I knew he was grieving, but so was I. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just grief. Because the attacks didn't stop. The alerts kept coming. More boats gone. More people missing. The authorities still refused to explain what was happening, but people had figured it out on their own. Nobody went near the lake anymore. Nobody dared. I waited a few days before I finally asked Dad, how did Grandpa know? He didn't look at me. Know what? His voice was hollow, tired. That they'd stop if I swallowed hard, forcing myself to say it, if he gave himself to them. Dad let out a slow, shaky breath. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he finally said, because his father did the same. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Your great-grandfather, Dad continued. His voice was flat, detached, like he was forcing himself to separate from the reality of what he was saying. When Grandpa was a boy, the same thing happened. The eels woke up. They started taking people. It got so bad, the government had to step in. I leaned forward. Step in how? Dad's expression darkened. They poisoned the lake. I stared. What? They dumped chemicals into the water, enough to kill anything that lived there. He let out a bitter laugh. It worked, for a while at least. I felt sick. But they weren't gone, I murmured. Dad shook his head. No, they were just waiting, breeding, growing, and now they're awake again. A horrible thought hit me all at once. The government knows. My voice was barely a whisper. Dad didn't respond, because he didn't have to. I thought about the news reports, the vague statements, the fact that no one was doing anything about it. They knew. They'd known all along. And the sacrifice? I asked, voice raw. Great-grandpa did it too? Dad nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. He went out onto the lake alone, and when he never came back, the attacks stopped. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. So that's it? That's what we do? Just feed them someone every time they wake up? Dad didn't say anything, because we both knew the answer. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, the distant lake lapping against the shore. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood. Lake Michigan wasn't just dangerous. It wasn't just unpredictable. It was hungry.